Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Paul Kincaid, Director of Congressional Outreach for FMC, the Association of Former Members of Congress. I'd like to welcome all of you to this special virtual roundtable. This week, we're happy to be working with NYU's John Bradamus Center, who advocate for civil debate on politics and public policy. For those of you who have missed our previous episodes, I'd invite you to visit our archives at www.usafmc.org/sounds. You can check out our other programs and subscribe to the virtual roundtable as a podcast, either on Spotify or on Apple. This is an interactive discussion today, so if you have a question at any time, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, fill out your name and your question, and if we choose you, I'll call on you to ask your question over audio only to our panel. Don't worry, if you're in your pajamas, nobody's going to know. Again, anytime during the call, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your center screen to ask the question. Today, our nation faces an election that is one of the most fraught with unknowns as any our nation has likely ever seen. Concerns about voting and the counting of and reporting of votes continue to grow, aided by the president. COVID-19 and the response to the global pandemic easily tops the concerns of most poll voters, with the economic recovery from it following closely behind. Now, the death of a globally treasured Supreme Court justice has poured a tanker full of gasoline onto an already roaring fire. Both parties are using the passing of Justice Ginsburg to raise money and to create motivation for their most consistent voters to go to the polls in November. Despite all of this, it's expected that voter participation will change very little in one respect: the age of the American electorate. 18 to 29-year-olds in this country have consistently lagged far behind other age cohorts, rarely topping 50%. The past two presidential elections have seen 45 and 46% of this group go to the polls. Today, we have a wonderful panel for a painfully needed discussion. Why do young people fail to vote? What issues would drive them to the polls? Do they trust the elected officials they're asked to choose between? And what is the most important thing on their mind as they go to the polls this year? We'll let our student panelists introduce themselves to you shortly. They'll talk with our moderator, former U.S. Rep. Dennis Ross. Congressman Ross represented Central Florida in Congress from 2011 until he left last year. Prior to that, he was in the Florida State House for 8 years. Now, he runs the American Center for Political Leadership at Southeastern University. Most importantly, he and one of our panelists are Florida Gators. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Congressman Ross and to our panel. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to everyone. You know, this is a crucial election. They say that every year, but probably in my lifetime, this is probably one of the most crucial. And I want to thank the former members of Congress and NYU's Bradamus Center for sponsoring this. I especially want to thank our panelists. We have Matthew Barocus from University of Florida, Timothy Cole Regels from University of Arizona, Sydney Holt from Penn State University at Erie, Shreedy Nayak from Ohio State University, I hope I said that correctly, and Avery Walter, who's a graduate school student at NC State University. You don't want to hear me talk. In fact, in this world today, all we do now is just have a lot of people talking. I think it's time we listen, and that's what today is about. We want to listen to this next generation, the ones who are going to face some of the greatest challenges that any generation has faced for quite some time. And so, without any further ado, what I'd like to do is go ahead and let each one of our panelists, starting off with Matthew, then we'll go to Timothy, Sydney, Shreedy, and Avery, just introduce themselves. And I want you also, after you introduce yourself, to answer this question: how would you politically define yourself? And has that changed any over time? And if so, what's made it change? Matthew, we'll go to you.
Good morning. I'm Matthew Barocus. I'm a fourth-year honor student at the University of Florida, studying history and political science. About my background, last year I served as the president of our College Democrats chapter at UF, so I led a membership of about 70 students. And this year I'm on secretary of the State Board of College Democrats, overseeing chapters at schools across the state. And also last summer, I was an intern at the US Department of State in their Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. And politically, I define myself as a moderate to progressive Democrat, moving with the mainstream of the party. And I think that's kind of stayed the same throughout most of my life, although I think the party has moved slightly leftward, even the center, in the past few years.
Thank you. Timothy.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. We appreciate it. So my name is Timothy Regels. I go by Cole, and I'm an Arizona native. I go to the University of Arizona as a junior studying economics. And I started my foray into politics probably about 2016 when I interned for Senator Jeff Flake down here in Tucson. Mm-hmm. And from there, I've been involved, working as staff and interning for several Democratic primary candidates. And then most recently, I worked for the International Republican Institute in Washington, D.C. as their Eurasia intern. I'm also an alumnus of the American Legion Boys State and Boys Nation programs. So I have a little bit of experience, and I'm looking forward to participating in the discussion.
Fantastic. Sydney.
Good morning.
Yeah.
My name is Sydney Holt, and I am a senior at Penn State. I graduate a semester early, so I graduate this December.
Very
My
nice.
background is I'm a political science major, and I minor in crime law, psychology, and women's studies. When it comes to school, I am president for our College Republicans on campus, as well as political society, as well as our organization called NEW, which is the Network of Enlightened Women. I go to CPAC every year, and I got an organization started on campus at Penn State Erie. I work for the Trump campaign, Trump Victory, here in Erie County. I'm a field organizer. As I organize, I campaign for other political actors locally, as well as our main focus is President Trump. So I do lean and consider myself pretty conservative as well. So I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say for today.
Fantastic. And Shreedy?
Hello. Yeah, you're saying it right.
Oh, good. Thank you.
My name is Shreedy Nayak. I'm a junior majoring in political science at The Ohio State University. As for my background, I got involved in politics in high school, and I've just been interested ever since. I interned in the Ohio Senate last semester, and I really enjoyed that. I'm currently an ambassador for OSU Votes, which is a nonpartisan group on campus, which works to get as many college students registered to vote as possible, because as we've mentioned, that's kind of a big issue. And I also do research for a project called Connecting to Congress. And I would say, defining myself politically, I am a Democrat and probably a little bit more far left. I used to be a big Bernie Sanders supporter, so yeah.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Avery.
Hey, yes, good morning. My name is Avery Walter. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a grad student in sociology at NC State University. I graduated from Appalachian State University. And if you're outside of North Carolina, that's probably the first time you've heard Appalachian pronounced correctly. So my research studies are on contemporary social movements, specifically Black social movements. And I've been organizing around political movements for about 5 years now. It's making me feel a little old. Especially on this panel, I'm starting to feel a little bit old. But yeah, if I had to politically align myself, love hearing that there's another Bernie supporter on this call. I almost wore my little Bernie 2016 sweatshirt, but I was like, that might be a little bit overkill. But yeah, I'm definitely very left-leaning. Definitely, yeah. Pretty left-leaning would be the best way to leave that.
You know, I don't know who picked the panel, but I think they did an exceptional job. We've got quite a diverse group, and one that I think covers just about all of the areas of the political spectrum, which is going to make this conversation even better. So let's get to it. What is the likely single best simple message to young people who are not planning to vote? Now, I'm assuming you all are planning to vote, and I can bet that's probably the case, but there's a large faction of your generation that just aren't going to vote. What's the best message you can give to them about why they should vote? And Avery, we'll start with you. We'll go back in reverse order.
Yeah, I think voting. So I'm a part of an organization called Black Youth Project 100, which is like a national organization of like radical Black folks and organizers. And this is a conversation that we butt heads about a lot because some folks find voting as kind of like a stepping stone or kind of help change our political landscape a little bit so that we are organizing in better conditions, whereas other folks, voting is not a part of their politic. It's contributing to an unjust system. It's legitimizing systems that folks don't believe in. And so this is definitely something that's super contested among radical Black organizers. And so I'm not in the business of shaming young folks who politically don't align with voting. I will be planning to vote myself. But I think that it's hard. It's really hard to tell people to vote if they don't feel like their candidates care about them or that their policies are actually going to be helpful and not harmful. I know that a lot of folks on the Democratic side are feeling kind of iffy about some of the policies that our candidates have supported. So I think, I think it's.
Is it more of a is it a more difficult message to minorities than to others, do you think, about why they should vote?
For sure. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Especially in the past 2 elections, having candidates that have passed that are harmful to Black people and marginalized people and trans people. It's a lot harder to then be told to suck it up and vote when you're like, these people, when they're in office, they're not helping me. So what do you want me to do? So I think that that's where a lot of that contention is coming from young organizers.
And that's a good point. We'll come back to that because one of the things we want to talk about is how do we change that. Shreedy, what is the likely single best simple message to young people who are not planning to vote? And do you think it would be different for minorities?
Yeah, so I actually agree with a lot of the things that Avery has said. I definitely wouldn't hold it against anyone if they said that they weren't going to vote in the upcoming election, because I think systemically there are a lot of ways in which people have been betrayed by the system. However, I think one of the biggest things that I try to tell people is just the change you want to see. It's going to happen very marginally. And, there are multiple ways, voting is just one part of civic engagement. And so kind of like Avery said, it is a stepping stone to getting to where you want to be. And then there are also other things you can do in the political realm to advocate for the change that you would like to see. I also know we're here to talk about things on more of a national level, but I think one other way to kind of talk to people about voting is to make them aware of like the importance of local elections and to go out and vote on election day, because local impact you a lot. And so even if you're not super enthusiastic about voting for national candidates, I think kind of emphasizing the importance of voting for, funding for your school district, funding for the police, whether you want it or not, in your local districts, in your county, that is also super important. But I would definitely say it is different for minorities because the system does not serve them. And so they don't feel incentivized to vote. And I think that's a very valid view.
Thank you. Sydney, what is the likely single best simple message to young people who are not planning to vote? And would it be different? Would that message be any different for minorities?
Yes, thank you. So what I tell people all the time, as I'm political society president and for College Republicans, I get a wide variety of students every single day. And what I emphasize to kind of go off Shreedy and Avery is, the local elections are a lot more important than what most people think. Start small is what I tell people. Your vote does matter. And if you're angry, if you're upset, if you don't like what your candidate is, going for what they support, or the opposing candidate, what they support, and what their, whole being is as what they would like to do in office, start locally. The change locally can make a bigger difference when it comes nationally. So if they don't like what's going on, change can happen. When it comes to minorities, I do think that, the education and voting, again, as a local elections, I think is extremely important. I work with a lot of local candidates here in Erie County, senators, state reps, you name it. I work with them. I campaign for them. All if I, think that their beliefs and what they stand for, are for the better of the people. So I think that voting is extremely important. That's what I tell all the students and everyone that I come in contact with, that it's just extremely important if you want to make change. If you want to do that movement, do it. And that's what voting is.
Excellent. Cole, what is a likely single best simple message to young people who are not planning to vote? And would this message be any different for minorities?
I'd say that the best way to get people to kind of take ownership is to tell them that it's theirs. So just reminding younger people that this is their democracy, that this is kind of their country, and that they have such a big part to play in it that they're not fulfilling. Now, I don't necessarily want to speak on behalf of minorities because I'm not one, but I would agree with what Avery and Shreedy are saying, and Sydney, that we need to kind of express grave concern for their safety, and show them that their vote does matter as well, and tell them that they have ownership too. So other than that, I don't think that there's anything that'll teach people that voting matters more than just life experience and some time under their belt. I mean, in 2000, no one expected the vote to come down to a couple hundred votes, and yours in Matthews State. So, but I guess that's my answer. So
Thank you. That was an exciting time. I was in the legislature at that time when we had to take the vote on the Bush v. Gore. Interesting. That will carry through, I think, to this election as well. Matthew, what is the likely single most simple message to young people who are not planning to vote? And would this message be any different for minorities?
Yeah, I think the simplest message is that it's relatively quick and easy to vote if you do it in certain ways. I mean, there's people debate for a long time about whether I should vote, whether I should not vote, but the actual process is 30 seconds if you know who you're going to vote for to bubble in the answers. And I think that can be really effective when you explain it to students that, hey, if you go to the student union during early voting and there's no line, you can be in and out in 5 minutes on your way to another class. However, that message does definitely change for low income and minority voters, because there are now prevalent laws like voter ID laws that can put up obstacles. And certainly since we've lost the vast majority of students on campus, absentee balloting does complicate that message. But in a normal election year, and even in some places, I think just explaining to people that if you're fretting about voting, it's really quite simple and fast to go do it and just get it over with. And I also, as Cole mentioned, I do have an easy sell in Florida to people when saying that your vote can make a massive difference, when all of our elections seem to come down to less than 10,000 votes in the last senatorial election, and then a few hundred back in 2000.
That is fascinating. Let me ask you this question, and we'll start, Shreedy, we'll start with you and then go back up the ladder to Sydney. Do you feel that your generation trusts the leaders today? And what qualities or attributes would you want to see in our leaders? Shreedy?
Yeah, I would say probably not. I think with a lot of the political behavior we've seen, especially in the last decade, and a lot of kind of the political manipulation we've seen among, party leaders and even presidents, I think the trust kind of isn't there. And I think kind of going along with that, one of the biggest things that I would kind of like to see more in our leaders, and this goes for both sides, or any side if we're remaining nonpartisan, is kind of acknowledging the fact that America does have flaws. Because I think a lot of times what leaders try to do is say, oh, everything's fine, we're just going to make it better, or it's not really that big of a deal. But I think kind of acknowledging, hey, America has this past that we need to reckon with, or there are things happening now that aren't ideal, they aren't great, and kind of accepting the fact that things aren't perfect. And then on top of that, not being afraid to make large structural changes for the better. So I think almost having that accountability and saying, we have work to do, instead of just saying, we're always number one, we're always great, and we're just making it better. Like, no, acknowledging that there's work to be done. That is something that I would like to see more.
Thank you. Sydney, what do you think your generation feels about our leaders today? Do they trust them? And what qualities or attributes do you want to see in our leaders?
I really do think that it goes on a wide scale of if they completely trust them 100% and or not at all. Attributes that I think that are very key is, you know, the strength and courage to compromise. We want to have this common goal, and being radical on both sides, I don't think is going to get anywhere. So if we have that common goal, we work together, I think that, you know, changes can occur and take, you know, tasks head on rather than, you know, having a press conference and just shying away of what actually happened. If, you know, like everyone was completely honest, takes the tasks head on, talk about it, have those difficult conversations rather than saying what the people would like to hear, I think that, you know, people would trust our elected officials a lot more.
Thank you. Cole, do you think your generation trusts today's leaders, and what qualities or attributes do you want to see in our leaders?
No, not at all. So, but I think that's part of a broader, large-scale problem. I know public institutional trust has been down for a long time now, and it's been rapidly declining since Watergate. So, like historically, it's not really that much of a surprise that public institutions aren't very trusted, nor are their leaders. So, now that said, for like inspiring trust, I think integrity is the most important. So when a leader can say something and follow through with it, when they're doing what you may not agree with, but you think is the right, they think is the right thing to do. I think a great, you know, example of this would have to be Senator John McCain. I mean, John McCain was a great man of integrity, and even though a lot of Arizonans perhaps didn't always agree with him 100%, you knew that he was saying what he meant and that he was going to follow through with it. So I want to see more of that from our public leaders, and I hope that we can kind of defect from the path that we're currently on.
Thank you. Matthew, what do you think your generation, well, does your generation trust today's leaders, and what qualities and attributes do you think or would you want to see in our leaders today?
I don't think my generation trusts our leaders all that much. And I think that's partly because they don't see themselves reflected in our leaders, both in terms of like literally, like as far as the age of our average lawmakers in Congress or state legislatures and our presidential candidates. But it's not always just age, as we've seen with the support for Senator Sanders, for Senator Markey. I think sometimes it's about just like even seeing the values of our generation is not being reflected by the vast majority of candidates.
Thank you. Avery, do you think your generation trusts our leaders today, and what qualities and attributes do you want to see in our leaders?
Absolutely not. I think, yeah, I don't think I've ever seen an election since maybe like 2008 that my generation has really felt like, yes, I trust this presidential candidate. I feel comfortable. I feel like X, Y, Z. But we were also a little over 10 years old, so I don't know what that says. But I think something that folks are looking for right now, especially from the organizing standpoint, is whether or not politicians are movable. I think for a while, folks got really excited about Warren because she was working with Black women and Black organizers and was starting to shift her platform a little bit after having conversations. And it was like, oh, this is like a politician that will actually listen if we collaborate with them, because every politician wants folks to collaborate with them, but they rarely ever change their policy in such a way. And so I think that that's something that's becoming increasingly more attractive for folks in elected officials that they're seeing. And also, I think they're just expecting more now. I think it's not enough for folks to just vote blue. It's not enough for folks to just vote with their political party. And they're really expecting folks to kind of go above and beyond with their policies versus just the bare minimum that they know will get the moderate vote, it'll get the liberal vote, and it will maybe get some left-leaning radical people, but probably not. But yeah, definitely expecting a little bit more.
Thank you. I don't want to dominate the questions here. So I think we've got some questions from our participants, and let's go to one. Paul, do you have that?
Yes, Congressman, we do. Alan McFarland has a question about the first time you all voted. Alan, you can go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Oh, thanks very much. That was a nice surprise. First of all, thank you all for sharing with us your perspective. This is all very, very helpful. I wanted to know, could you each share the first time you ever casted a ballot, whether it be a local or national election? Talk about that experience, how you felt, and the process, particularly for students who've never voted before.
And we'll start off with, I believe it's Sydney's turn on this one.
Thank you. My first ballot was a local election. I first went in and my experience necessarily was, you know, the people within that poll watcher could tell that I was like a first time voter. It kind of made it difficult for me to vote. But, you know, once I got it, you know, like I felt that, you know, I really was making a difference. And I think that that's another way that, you know, young voters can vote is, you know, expressing your experiences first time voting, because, you know, it does feel good. It does feel like you're making a difference. You know, afterwards you walk out of your polling station and it's kind of like a nice feeling that, you know, you've made that difference. You've put in your effort, you know, for those changes to occur. What was the last part for the question?
Just the first time you cast the ballot and how you felt about it.
Okay, yeah, and then I voted in various different ways locally, and you know, this would be my first time for a general election. I voted by mail-in ballot this past primary election, and I felt extremely comfortable when it comes to the PA rules and laws of the mail-in ballots. I get an email every single time it is processed anywhere. Because I work for the Trump campaign, I don't have time in order to go to the polls because of Act 77. It takes a lot longer to actually vote. It's not straight party voting this year. So it comes with like longer lines. I'm also not from Erie County. I'm from McKean County in PA. So I wouldn't be able to go back home either. Absentee ballots, I still don't have time to go to a different polling place. I don't have a different reason. So the mail-in ballot was kind of the last resort, although I wouldn't like to have done a mail-in ballot. I do feel comfortable in doing so after doing it. So the experience and having that experience, it makes a big difference, especially because I then figured out when you send in the mail-in ballots, you get an email when it was delivered to the courthouse, when it was processed, and when your ballot was counted. So it gave me a sense of, you know, reassurance that, you know, the system really is not as awful as most people think. So yeah, I think that, you know, voting in various ways made me feel a lot better about voting and then telling other people about it.
Thank you, Sydney. Cole, do you remember the first time you cast a ballot?
I do actually. So it was the 2018 midterm elections, and I decided that Arizona has like a pretty great system when it comes to mail-in ballots, but I decided that I wanted to vote in person to get the experience, because there's nothing really like going to the ballot box. So I decided to do that, and it was a great experience. It was very, very easy. Registering took only a couple minutes of my time, and actually I believe that I could have registered there on that day if I really wanted to. So there wasn't really many obstacles to voting, and since then I've signed up for the mail-in ballots, and that's been it.
Thanks, Matthew.
My first voting was the 2018 Florida Gubernatorial primary. That was really exciting. It was my sophomore year, and I'd been involved in our college Dems chapter, and we had all the gubernatorial candidates in the primary come speak to our chapter. So that was really the first time for an election I truly interacted personally with all the candidates and could make my decision kind of based off those interactions, in addition to like platform and campaigning and stuff. And so it was a really happy moment. And then as far as because we've all kind of touched on like this year, I'm registered back down in Miami. I was home back in 2018 when I got to vote then, but I ordered an absentee ballot, but I'm seriously considering making the 10-hour round trip drive from Gainesville to Miami to be able to go vote in person on either early voting or election day, just to have a bit more sense of comfort than like waiting for a ballot to come here and sending it back.
Avery, how about you? Do you remember the first time?
I do. I was actually very lucky that the person I voted for the first time in a congressional race when I was an undergrad, she actually came to App State and I got to meet her and talk to her. She did not win, but I felt like I sucked it up and I voted, and it got done and it was quick and easy, because I think that a lot of student polling places, especially depending where you are, a small town like Boone, North Carolina, it didn't take very long, so it was a lot more quick and easy than I think a lot of students assume it was. But yeah, sucked it up and got it done.
Good for you. Shreedy, real quickly, do you remember when you first voted?
I do. So I voted in the primaries back in 2018. I also am from a very small town, so it was very straightforward, went in person, got it done. I remember feeling very empowered and also, like many people, very excited about the little sticker.
Fantastic. Okay, let's make this a little bit more interactive, okay? Now, you all are from battleground states. That's one of the reasons we're glad you're here. And this impacts, your state will impact the outcome of the election. Do you have a question? Let's go to, let's take Matthew. Matthew, is there a question you'd like to ask anybody on the panel? And if so, who is it and what is your question?
Sure. I'll probably ask Cole, because I think we might kind of be the opposite reflections in each other's party. What kind of you look for in your party from a commitment to democracy? I know there's been a lot of talk about a peaceful transition of power and stuff. So kind of what you see as that role in the election, and kind of also what you view from my party, Democratic Party, as like our role in democracy.
Cole?
Well, thanks, Matthew, for the question. And actually, I forgot to tell you all this, but surprise, I'm a Democrat. So,
I love it.
But I mean, I would suppose I'm a very, very moderate Democrat. And so if at some point other in time we were talking to one another, maybe I could have been a moderate Republican. And for that case, I'd say that it's really concerning when the president is giving those remarks and he doesn't give a very straightforward answer to such a simple question on whether there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power. And that's what I'm talking about when I talked about integrity. So the president is not a person of integrity. He's not. And I don't know that there's many people who would defend him on that. And so, yeah, I'd say that the Republican Party is in an interesting time right now. They're kind of in turmoil, and it's no longer the Republican Party nor a conservative party, but just the party of Trump. So I hope to see that change sometime in the near future, and perhaps I can start voting for moderate Republicans. But thanks, Matthew, for your question.
All right, so we're going to go to Sydney. Sydney, is there anybody on the panel you'd like to ask a question of? And if so, what would be that question?
I guess I can ask anybody now, since it's kind of obvious that I'm kind of like the black sheep of the Zoom, but if you were to ever, I know that whether, depending on what your political affiliation is, what would you think an acceptable candidate would attribute from the opposing party if someone was running for the presidential election, a lot of people say that, like it's one side or the other, like it's the lesser of two evils. If you were to have two actually good candidates, what, personalities, attributions do you think would you be looking for both candidates on opposing sides?
Who'd like to take a stab at that? How about you, Avery? What would you look for on both sides? What attributes would you look for?
Oh, I think one of the things I'm thinking about that comes to mind, thank you, Sydney, for that question, is consistency. I think that now that we're in this kind of hyper social media age, where we now have like a decade of things that are documented, at least on the internet, it's a lot harder to trust politicians because you see things that they've said in the previous elections. I know that I think Tom Tillis is struggling with that in North Carolina right now in regards to some public health comments in the past. And so like, at least be consistent with the policies that you're talking about currently in relation to ones that you were just talking about last election or just a couple of months ago. Or if a couple of months ago you were anti-protests or anti Black Lives Matter, anti any of these movements that are coming up, maybe during your electoral campaign, don't say, oh, suddenly now I love them. They're great. They're the pillars of our democracy. So I think, yeah, consistency is the most key for me.
Thank you. Okay, Paul, we're going to go back to you. We've got another question from one of our audience participators, and specifically about how do we get in touch with this this particular age group. Paul, I'll let you articulate that question.
Yes, sir, Congressman. Joe Proctor in our audience has a question. And Joe, if you want to go ahead and unmute your phone or unmute your Zoom and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, I'm asking this question because I did public relations and communications for both Harvard and Williams College for 35 years. And so I have this question, and that is, what's the best way to communicate with your generation, and what could the two presidents do better?
Who wants to take a stab at that? Shruti?
Sure. So for the first part, I think the most obvious thing that stands out is social media and just kind of being aware of the fact that, you know, it is 2020. And so I currently intern for a state representative's campaign, and we not only do phone calls, but for younger age groups, we text bank, you know, because people our age don't like to answer the phone. And so I think one of the best ways to reach people is by text. And then with social media, especially with Instagram over the summer, with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think making that information accessible on like various social media platforms is crucial to make sure that younger voters are paying attention. And I think for either side, for both presidents, I think that is part of it as well. Just if they want to reach that younger voter base, making use of their social media platforms. We see Trump do it pretty well with Twitter. I personally don't follow his Instagram, so I'm actually not sure what that feed looks like, but I know for the Biden-Harris feed, it is pretty up to date on Instagram, and I think that's a pretty effective way to reach people.
Thank you. Anybody else want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab too. Social media, definitely, but I think always try to do it in an authentic way. I think in 2016, we saw a bit of like a ham-fisted approach. The quote that still is a meme among my generation is like, Pokemon go to the polls from Hillary Clinton. You just like can't just like try social media because it's where we're at. Like you have to actually use it in authentic ways that won't immediately jump out to people of our voting group as like, they're like just trying this because that's what they think we like.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else? Before we go on? Let's go on to something that I think is very important that your generation has the opportunity to really impact. You're talking, you know, we've been talking right now about civic engagement and the significance of that, and, you know, getting your generation out to vote, to get them to participate. As one of you pointed out, civic engagement is much more than voting. It's getting involved. It's being part of the process. But part of that also is civility. You know, one of the things, even going back to the founding of our nation, those founders weren't the best of friends all the time. In fact, they had some serious disagreements and tensions amongst each other. Adams and Jefferson, for example. Do you think civility is important for good leadership? And how would you define civility in advocacy for your position? Who would like to take that? First one of that.
I'll take it, Congressman.
All right. Thank you, Cole.
No problem. So I'd say civility is merely just a matter of respect. It's being able to sit down and have disagreements with someone else, but listen to them and understand that they may have different motivations and that you shouldn't question another person's motivations, but really their reasonings for them. So now, as coming from our leaders, I suppose, was that the second part of your question?
Yes.
It's I'd say that probably Joe Biden is doing a pretty decent job at that. As you know, we've always kind of been civil to a degree. It's really kind of ramped up in civility in the recent past. But it's a matter of being able to sit down and saying that the other person is not your enemy or your threat to life, or they're not going to destroy your way of life. They're just another person. They're another American who has different ideas than you. We all have a similar goal, but we just have different ways of getting there. So
Fantastic. Anybody else want to comment on civility and whether it's important, and how would you define it? Okay. Well, let me ask you this question. 2020 has been one of the most bizarre years in my lifetime, and I'm sure in yours as well. And now, as we are just 6 weeks away from an election, we have mournfully experienced the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And there's a move afoot, of course, to replace her, as that should be done. I mean, it's a constitutional requirement. Let me ask you, because you are from battleground states, will the decisions by current senators with regard to Supreme Court nominee, whomever that may be, influence your decision in the presidential election? And we'll start with you, Shreedy.
No, I don't really think so. I think I plan to vote how I plan to vote in November, regardless of what happens in the Senate with the confirmation of a new justice.
Okay. How about you, Matthew?
Ultimately, no.
Avery?
I don't think so. Not right now.
All right. Sydney?
Not at all.
Okay. And Cole? Yeah, Cole.
the nail was in the coffin long before this, Congressman.
I appreciate that. You know, I think that's probably a sentiment that may be shared by a majority of people in the United States. Let's go back to Paul. We have another question in the audience. Paul, go ahead.
Yes, sir, Congressman. Lester Levine has a question about what issue is most important to young people in the election this year. Lester, if you can unmute your microphone, you can ask your question.
Sure. I am the founder and leader of about a 900-person citizen group across the country, which includes some younger people. And we work on the U.S. House candidates only. So it's very important to our candidates to understand how to reach young people. Among all the issues, what do you think is the number one issue of concern to young people? And I would just list a couple of candidates, so to speak. Climate change, criminal justice reform, or perhaps two, but if there's something else, what's the number one issue?
Sydney, we'll start with you.
Yeah, especially now with, a lot that is going on, I think our, certain freedoms is a huge issue, concern. It's on the front of everyone's mind when it comes to freedom of expression with speech, the right to with the Second Amendment. I think those are probably the two biggest things that are on young people's minds, especially when it comes to movements occurring and the unwillingness to have those, peaceful if they agree with them, no matter what your political affiliation is, whether they have the right to do that under the, lawfully as well. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that comes to my mind.
Matthew, number one issue.
Might be a bit of a cop-out answer, but I don't know if there's a single issue that I could say is number one higher than any others. I would say that just in the moment right now, I think criminal justice and racial issues are the highest priority, but I don't know if that's going to be the long-term longest issue. I think climate change probably throughout our lifetimes as voters will become the number one.
Avery, number one issue.
I think for me, it's got to be policing and criminal justice. I'm not a reformist. I'll be very honest about that. But I think that bare minimum, I would really push for politicians to be adding some form of defunding onto their platform at the bare minimum.
Shruti, number one issue?
I would have to agree, I think, with the events over the summer and still going on now, criminal justice reform and addressing mass incarceration.
Okay. How about you, Cole?
I don't want to downplay anyone else's answers because they all stand, but I'd say number one is probably the economy and the response to the coronavirus pandemic. So that's definitely a number one concern for everyone, but for young people especially, people leaving college, people graduating from high school who want to get onto the workforce, they're seeing their opportunities decline, and we want to see our leaders address this.
Let me ask you a quick question, and just briefly, if you would, comment on, I guess, Cole, I guess you're studying economics, so I'll start with you, and since we're still on with you, the fiscal impact of continued growth of debt and deficit in our nation. I mean, your generation is going to inherit significant, and there's no, I'm not asking you to point the finger of blame, because that is spread amongst both parties, amongst a lot of people. How would you recommend that we handle the exponential growth of our debt of this nation? And just briefly, I mean, I'm talking 30 seconds or less. I mean, Cole, go for it.
Oh, Congressman, I wish you didn't throw this question at me, because that's a big answer for 30 seconds. But the best way to handle debt in any case is to reduce expenses and increase taxes. So when you reduce expenditures and increase taxes, you can start paying off that debt. We had a fantastic ability to do so in the late 90s. Congress decided to not, because actually the retention of having debt was more important than paying it off. So I would say that you would eventually have to cut expenditures and increase, government revenue, but I don't see that happening politically anytime soon, especially in the current state that we're in.
Avery, any comments?
Yeah, I think to speak a little bit about like public perceptions, I think that folks also assume that we can't address the debt, that it's too big and that folks won't get behind it enough. But I think what we saw from the primaries is that folks are ready to increase those taxes, especially on folks making more money, in order to address these systemic issues that are being caused by debt and how they're disproportionately affecting young folks' futures, low-income Black and Brown people who are being literally crushed by this debt. It's nuts.
Sydney, what do you say?
I definitely think that reorganizing our priorities on expenses and where we spend our money throughout the country is a huge factor with what we need to do and able to decrease the debt that we do have. Not necessarily taking more from people, but maybe a percentage of, like for taxes, a straight line percentage rather than taking more from others. It's not really the way that I was raised. I work hard for what I do. So taking more because I work, hard, I don't really think is probably the right way to go about a situation. But I do think that a reorganization does need to occur when it comes to where our money does go.
Matthew, what do you say about our debt and its growth and how it's going to impact your generation?
I think I don't think debt is at the top of the list for a lot of voters of our generation thinking about the future. But I think there is, as far as dealing with it, a greater level of comfort for more taxes on the wealthy, even the upper middle class, because I don't think a lot of people in my generation think they're going to make it into the even middle class or even upper middle class. And so they don't see themselves as being affected by those taxes that are much more comfortable kind of levying them.
How about you, Shreedy?
Yeah, I think to kind of go with the majority, I think since it is such a big burden, kind of acknowledging the fact that it is time to just start raising the taxes. And, again, I know it's like a common point of disagreement, but I think as we have seen recently, a lot more people are on board with it.
Gotcha. Hey, Paul, you want to go back to one more audience question?
Yes, sir. I think we can do that. Thomas Little is in our audience and had a question based on one of the questions you asked, Congressman, about civility. Thomas, if you want to go ahead and unmute your microphone, you can ask your question.
Great. It was just related to the civility. I noticed only one person responded, and kind of watching the body language of the other panelists and the deafening silence. I wondered, to push that a little bit, does that indicate that civility is not particularly high on the list, or that maybe it's the time has come that civility is not as important? Just watching the body language of some of the panelists and the silence made me wonder.
Thank you, Thomas. And let's go. Let's go to Avery, because I think that's a pretty interesting perspective. When we had a question earlier about attributes and qualities we want to see in our leaders, is civility that? Is that one of those qualities? Avery, what do you want to say about civility? Is it that important?
I feel like I was probably one of those body language people. I'm really bad at facial expression. I thought I did. But I think I feel complicated about civility, right? I think that many times, and again, I'm uplifting the voices of other marginalized people. I think oftentimes we're told civility is key. Compromise is a huge one that comes along with civility. And I think that sometimes when you're discussing social issues, policies, and the quote unquote theoretical other side, if their policies are something that is directly harmful to me or my identities, to my community, to my ability to live, it's a little hard for me to come and say civility. Yes, civility is the most important thing for me to have right now. Obviously, if I was in a situation talking to, like, say, a right-leaning senator or a congressman, I wouldn't kind of blow up in their face if I worked really hard to get that meeting. But I think it's hard. It's a hard thing to ask of people when they're being directly attacked by some of these policies, because it's easy to say it's a difference of opinions, but I think that some of these policies have years-long damage to communities and to families. So that's why, yeah, it's a little complicated for me to say that.
Gotcha. Who else wants to comment on civility and whether it's important or not?
I can comment. I agree definitely with Avery that civility requires, to be civil to someone requires a baseline of mutual respect from them for your identity. And you have to feel like they think that you have the right to be speaking to them. And sometimes it can feel like that doesn't exist. And civility also requires a democratic legitimacy. So if someone wins office without a popular mandate, or if they campaign in a particularly aggressive way, it can be really hard to then have a civil conversation with them once they win.
Sydney, what do you say?
I also do think that, it is kind of a difficult thing to discuss when it comes to civility, being that, some things may be prioritized as more important than the other. I do think that, some may use others simply as a means, but without respect. But I do think that that is definitely a huge thing that I think that needs to be, part of the attributes to all elected officials, whether that, the people that, they work for the people and, what they would like, and having civility, I think, is extremely important.
What do you say, Shreedy?
I do think civility is important, and I do think it involves the mutual respect portion of it, especially I think actively listening to both sides and kind of, not just saying, oh, I hear you, like actually listening and like saying, oh, okay, I hear you, and acknowledging opposing viewpoints. But then I also think that when it comes down to it, when you reach a very moral disagreement, a very deep-rooted disagreement, and there are policies and decisions that are actively harming people, I would say at that point, civility is a little bit less important, and it's more important to fight for what you think is right.
Thank you. Cole, you want to comment?
I would just say that, civility is a hallmark in the political process and any democratic process. So I can understand there's going to be needs for incivility. There's going to be needs for perhaps not being the most polite person to someone in order to get your point across, or perhaps to forward your movement. But I would say for the day-to-day legislating, civility is absolutely necessary.
Thank you. And just to follow up on this, and this will take just less than 2 seconds per person, I have always advocated that whomever may be your adversary today may need to be your ally tomorrow. Do you agree with that, Matthew?
Yes.
Timothy or Cole?
Yes.
Sydney?
Yes.
Trudy?
Yes.
Avery?
Yes.
All right. I wasn't said yeah, but I just think that's really important to know, because and the political process is such a morass of moving parts that you'll find that you make some interesting friends of different political persuasions in order to accomplish a different objective. And I think that's an underlying tone that goes through a lot of this process that we have. Let's talk about international relations, something we haven't addressed yet. How important to you is our stature in the international community? You know, we've had quite a few skirmishes with China right now, not only militarily with what's going on in the South China Sea, also with tariffs, also with COVID. You've seen in the Mideast, the UAE and Bahrain peace accords with Israel. What we've talked about so far has been pretty domestic. But let me ask you, and quickly, if you can, how important or how significant is it to you about our international stature or perception? And we'll start with you, Shreedy.
Yeah, so I definitely think international stature is important. And I think, just where we are on the world stage, but I also think that it is our responsibility when we see injustices occurring, with Israel, Palestine, with China, when we see these injustices occurring, that the US doesn't have to try and stay kind of civil. We speak out against it, even if it comes at maybe a cost with allyship to those countries.
Matthew?
So our U.S. world standing is incredibly important to me personally, someone who aspires to join the U.S. Foreign Service, but as kind of a representative of a average college student or politically engaged college student, I think the priority there is that our international leadership be helpful in kind of domestic issues, and that I think for a lot of voters, they're a bit more isolationist in the sense of like they would like to see us kind of withdraw from our longstanding conflicts and really focus on internal nation building as opposed to overseas.
Sydney?
That doesn't mean they want to abandon U.S. leadership if it can be helpful here as well.
Gotcha. Sydney?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Shreedy and Matthew both. I do think it's an extremely important thing that we need to focus on. Rather, once we fix ourselves domestically, we can then expand, worldwide in a successful manner.
Thank you. Avery? Internationally, how do you think is that important?
I might be, as Matthew said, a little bit more isolationist. I don't really love the ways that the U.S. has tried to assert dominance and assert authority over certain countries, notably looking at like Palestine and things like that. Fun topics. I don't know if I have like a desire for us to expand or anything like that globally. But I do think, I think we should definitely focus a little bit more internally and also potentially helping to resolve some of the harm and conflict that we've caused over decades. But we are still there. So maybe, addressing some of the issues that we've caused there before we just pull out. But
thank you, Avery. Cole, real quickly, internationally.
Congressman, our position internationally is perhaps one of the most important things to me personally, and I would say it should be important to every single American. The world has never been a safer place since the United States kind of took the #1 spot since the end of World War II. Democracy has been growing worldwide. We've been seeing greater increases in quality of life. Abject poverty has been on rapid decline ever since then. So without the United States in that #1 spot, protecting freedom, and I guess that's a catchword, but protecting democracy and free trade, especially internationally, I don't think that we would be seeing conditions where there are less people in abject poverty worldwide, where we would be safer. and where our allies would be safer. U.S. leadership is perhaps the most important thing that Americans can consider when they're going to the ballot box this November.
Gotcha. I know we're coming up to the noon hour, and we're going to close here. But before we do, I want to do a quick lightning round, seconds per person. Who wins and why in this presidential election? And we'll start with you, Cole. Second. 10
Joe
seconds.
Biden.
Why?
Joe Biden, and he wins because Donald Trump is not a very liked person.
Sydney?
Donald Trump, because he's for the people.
Shruti?
Joe Biden, because people have been unsatisfied with Donald Trump.
Matthew?
Joe Biden wins the popular vote and possibly more electors than Donald Trump. I don't know if that means he'll be the next president, and because he builds a broader coalition of folks.
And Avery, close us out with who wins and why.
I hope Joe Biden, because of the dissatisfaction in folks moving to the other side, but I would not be surprised if the Electoral College gave us another 4 years of Trump.
Okay. Look, I want to thank everybody for not only participating by listening, but also I want to thank our participants. Your generation has the potential of being the next best generation, and we're darn sure giving you the challenges to accomplish that. That being said, we also understand that this process that has been in place for 233 years requires citizen involvement to take ownership of our citizenship. And you get that. That's why you're part of this program. It's why you're in a battleground state getting involved in the process. But more importantly, I want to thank you for your opinions today. Your opportunities for leadership are going to come faster than you've ever imagined. And you will have a lot of people that will gravitate to you because of your understanding of political issues and your involvement in the political process. I want to thank NYU's John Bradamus Center, which advocates civil debate on politics and public policy. And I want to thank the former members of Congress for putting this together. This is a foundation for us that we hope will continue to grow and incentivize your generation to be involved and be that positive change that each of us wants to see. What we saw here was diverse of opinions, diversity of ideas, but more importantly, what we see here is a great future for our nation. So I want to thank everyone for participating. I love the Dalmatian, Avery. You guys have a wonderful time, and don't forget, get out there, get involved, vote, and follow up on that vote and make sure we make this nation better. Thanks for joining us. Paul?
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.